First, from the perspective of German Jews in the 1930s, was it possible to foresee the Holocaust from actions like the Nuremberg laws? Why or why not? What do you think?
I think the majority of the Jews in Germany never thought the Holocaust would happen. They were Germans first, they were Jews second. I think a small number did perceive something not good. I don't think they perceived death. And those are the ones who were able to get out. They had enough money and so forth. But I think, as you said at the beginning, it was a progression. I don't necessarily believe the Jews were foreseen to die in the numbers they did until they had so many of them, they didn't know what to do with them. Mm-hmm. And that's when the final solution, when they got to Poland, that's really when the final solution became reality. It was talk, but it wasn't put into action until then.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that, I mean, you could say it's possible to foresee if someone happened to have, like, you know, recently been studying the Armenian genocide or something. But I mean, from the point of view of the people there, the vast majority of the time when sort of these sort of steps were taken, you didn't see something on the scale of the Holocaust. You know, you probably could foresee some pogroms, but I don't think that with the evidence you got in the early 1930s, at least in the mid and maybe by the late 1930s, you might be a little bit more worried. But generally, I think the money would be on a series of pogroms and possibly enslavement, but I don't think the money would have been on the magnitude of what ended up happening.
Sure. Yeah, Laura, you were going to add something?
I think that, I mean, on that same, I mean, what she's saying, the same thing. I think that, you know, it's one thing to look at the Ottomans and say, you know, well, they're not really, you know, they're not that civilized, you know, but this is Germany. This is the center of a European civilization in many ways. And these laws were sort of reflected the sort of ghettoization sort of laws that we'd seen already in the past. Who could conceive of such a killing? I mean, who could sit there and look at it and go like, oh yes, this is going to have this happen? I mean, yeah. it was, I mean, who could think of that? I mean, we look at it now backwards, like, you know, looking in hindsight saying, well, yeah, we should have seen this coming, but I don't see how people could have seen this coming in such a massive, I mean, who could have imagined that someone would be able to do something like that? And especially, quite frankly, the Germans or the French or the English, people in the Central Europe there, you would consider to be some of the most sort of civilized in the world, so to speak. If you, I think that, I don't think that the Jews in Germany could have
yeah, except for the fact that with looking backwards historically, the last 4 years, with vast knowledge of what happened, and seeing some of the same cues now, nobody today raised, or in the last 4 years, raised any alarms looking at very similar patterns.
No, plenty of people raised alarms. You just had large swaths of people who ignored the alarm.
If I could just interject something, if the people would have read Mein Kampf, they would have noticed that was Hitler's, how could I say it, intentions, even back in the 20s when he wrote it. And it was the first step were the Nuremberg laws.
Well, Alan, have you read Mein Kampf?
Years and years and years and years ago.
Because my understanding is, I actually haven't read the whole thing, I've read pieces of it. My understanding is that you could read it as a desire to exclude the Jews from German society. So an expulsion, like a 1492 Spain expulsion, but not necessarily a global killing of all Jews possible.
Yeah. Also, not only that, Hitler didn't blame the Jews for World War I. He blamed all the lazy workers back in the home front for not helping out. And the other thing too, growing up next door was our neighbor. He was a German Jew, and he was a butcher, and he left, I think, around 37. And the reason why he left is because he couldn't work anymore. He was a butcher, but he couldn't serve any Christians. So he decided it was time to get out, and he did.
Yeah. Although, Al, I will mention there was a story of Jews stabbing, Jews and communists stabbing the army in the back as part of the reason for why Germany lost the war. So there was some blame of Jews for losing World War I as part of the Nazi sort of platform of blaming them. It wasn't only the home front workers.
No, I think that if we can look back, knowing what we know, and say, we can't be sure whether the intent was the outcome or not, then it's really putting a huge burden on the people who live there to predict it. So I would suspect that it wouldn't be possible to foresee, since we can't even decide with the advantage of hindsight.
Right.
And aside from that, I agree very much with what Lori said, that we have seen terrible things going on throughout history, and there probably was not an expectation that this would be qualitatively different.
Right. Okay, next question. Even more uplifting. What were the most outrageous, offensive aspects of the final solution?
I think that I mean, even more than putting people to death, it was the complete negation of people's humanity in every possible way, from cutting their hair to stealing their teeth to stripping them down and having them go to the gas chambers that way, all mixed in sex, and just a complete denial of any kind of human dignity, whatever.
Even giving them numbers instead of names.
Yeah, numbers instead of names. Yeah.
Yep. Susie, we're going to jump in.
Oh, it's hard to say. There was so much dehumanization, and the mechanization of the horrors, that any way to kill people was a good thing. The total lack of any sensitivity, that whatever it does, whether it's working them to death, starving, disease, whatever it is, it's okay. That total disregard of any kind of recognition of humanity, once again.
Yeah. Roger?
To me, one of the most outrageous things beyond what was done was how many people either were complicit or looked the other way. I mean, in terms of outrage, that was one of the more eye-opening and devastating things beyond the deaths and the torture was the complete loss of faith in humanity.
Right.
I mean,
or the insult of claiming to be unaware, or I was just following orders later. That's even more insulting. Absolutely, all those things, the mechanization, so it was just a matter of flipping switches, and you could pretend it was just an automated process. Other thoughts?
I gotta say, for me, I'd say it's just the murder part. I mean, because let's face it, I mean, the other stuff, we've had stuff like that all the time. I mean, the dehumanization of whatever enemy we have is just human nature. We always do that. I mean, look at the caricatures of Japanese people in America in World War II. I think the thing that really stepped it up was just murdering so many people. That was really the most outrageous, offensive aspect. That was, I mean, humans quite often treat people as less than humans and like dogs, and they enslave people, and they put people in ghettos or concentration camps. I mean, that's not really uncommon in humanity, and really killing people isn't either. But I'd say just the killing of complete non-combatants on such a scale for no reason other than the killing of them, not to to frighten an enemy into surrendering, not to, not even to steal resources, just purely for the desire of killing them. I'd say that really is the peak.
Other than to steal their resources and use their bodies for raw material and their hair for pillows. That's.
But that was secondary to the killing. It wasn't, you're not killing someone in order to rob them. You're robbing them as a secondary effect of the primary goal, which is killing them.
Yeah. Go ahead, Lori.
Well, I'd like to respond to two things. First, to that, I don't entirely agree with that, because if you look at what happened in the 30 Years' War, for example, there were tremendous deaths of civilians, innocent civilians in cities that the armies roar over. From Tamerlane to, it's not unusual for people to destroy. Look at the Bible, going and conquering Canaan, killing all the men and women and children and taking their cities and their cattle. There's a lot of that that goes on. But let me just say one thing in response to Roger, okay? And that is, there's a book by a guy named Meyer. I always forget his first name, but it's called "They Thought They Were Free." And this guy was an American Jew who'd been a soldier in the war and went to Hess after the war. Didn't tell anybody he was Jewish, just that he was American. He was interviewing people who'd been members of the Nazi Party. And he published 10 of the interviews. And only one of these guys was a real flat out racist Nazi. The rest of them were like, and I'm not excusing what they do, but one guy said, well, what did you think when they took the butcher away? Well, the newspaper said that there was these violent people and they were trying to protect them. So they took them off to these camps because they were, it was difficult for Germans to live with these people. And by the way, who was I to go to the police department and stick my neck out for the butcher? And you kind of have to put yourself in their shoes. One guy joined the Nazi Party because he was going to lose his job if he didn't, because you need to be a party member in order to have the job. And again, I'm not excusing people from doing some of these things, but it's also understandable why many people turned their heads and didn't want to get involved, didn't want to put their neck out.
There's a wonderful book called Ordinary Men, which explores what happened to a reserve police battalion that was pressed into service. They were not frontline Nazis. These were men in their 40s. They were not part of the Hitler Youth. But they were pressed into service to wipe out the Jews of a particular town. And they were even told they could drop out if they wanted to, but because it was a war, and because they were told this is the enemy, they did it. And some of them were tortured by it. They tortured in a relative sense, obviously. Their consciences were tortured, but they did it. They fulfilled the orders. You can look at the famous example of the Milgram psychology experiments of, will people go very far following the authority of someone saying, inflict shocks on someone for science? And in fact, the vast majority of people would go to lethal levels following authority. So, other examples.
Massacre in Vietnam.
Yeah, sure. Other examples of the outrageous aspects, the attempts to eradicate Jewish history, not just the people, but wiping out documents, wiping out buildings, killing entire families, often in front of each other, in the most painful order possible. Deceiving the victims to the very end, still saying here for disinfection, cleanliness helps avoid death. Forcing other Jews to help in the killing process so as to implicate themselves or to sort of offload the guilt on the collaborators, the gray zone people that were also under threat of death. The fact that cremation left no place, no stone marker, no location, and in fact it was contrary to Jewish tradition, but also just anonymous raw material again. This is the most efficient way to deal with the most bodies quickly. There was something called excremental assault, which you can read about in a book called Survivor Type by Terence Dupre, DES_PRES, where they would prohibit doing normal excretory functions to break down your sense of self and to undermine any sense of camaraderie between people or any kind of sympathy you might get from the surrounding world. Because if you stink and you're disgusting, who's going to want to help you? And you don't even like yourself, let alone the people you're forced to live with. Not allowing trips to the bathroom for days and things like, these are things that aren't talked about often, but were a crucial part of the dehumanization process of getting people to hate themselves and to have almost no solidarity between the prisoners. Yes, Roger, then we're going to move on.
Yeah, and then there were the human medical experiments,
Right.
which are almost indescribable.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Third question is, what were some of the obstacles to and successes of Jewish resistance during the Holocaust? So we talked about this a little bit earlier. The obstacles include things like collective punishment, the fact they were starving, the fact they were an urban population that wasn't trained or equipped to do this. The non-Jewish population wasn't particularly interested in helping them. In fact, in the Polish resistance, they didn't want to give the Jews guns for the Warsaw Ghetto resistance organization because they were afraid the Jews wouldn't bother using it. They didn't believe Jews would actually fight back. Ironically, the unwillingness to give up hope was an obstacle. You know, when the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion happened, it's because they knew they were going to die. They just wanted to die with dignity. The vast majority of Jews in Warsaw were already dead by the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion. They'd been sent to Treblinka and gassed in the thousands in 1942 and the first part of 43. The rebellion took place after most of the Jews in Warsaw were dead. It was for dignity, but not for survival.
Well,
yeah.
A couple of things for Jewish resistance. One, we saw when we saw the movie with Daniel Crane several years ago at the Sills House, and that was just surviving day to day was resistance when the objective was for you not to do so. And the other thing we saw when we were in Israel with you a few years ago at the Holocaust Museum was any ray of pleasure or the benevolence of life, the artistry, the concerts people did, all of that affirmed life in the face of opposition to it is an act of resistance. Any Jew who had a moment of pleasure when he or she was to be denied it by the Nazis was resisting. Those are successes of resistance.
Mm-hmm. Getting the word out of what was happening or preserving it. There was a group in Warsaw it was called the Oneg Shabbos group that created archives. They were actually historians, and they created an archive of life in the ghetto. They collected newsletters and pamphlets and samples of ghetto currency and ration coupons and all kinds of material, and they buried them in milk cans in 3 different locations in the ghetto, and 2 of the milk cans were found. We never found the third one, but we found 2 of those archived milk cans, and most of that group didn't survive. They were caught either when the ghetto was closed or afterwards in Warsaw when they were hiding. And, you know, maintaining institutions, schools, keeping up morale and hope. And there was actual armed resistance too. Okay, how did the outside world, the bystanders, react to the Holocaust? How much blame do they share for the disaster?
I'd say that the racist anti-immigration laws done by lots of countries, most notably ours, had a huge blame for it because, as you said earlier, I mean, I don't think that if Hitler could have just shipped all the Jews off to America or something, that anywhere near the numbers would have been killed. And it's not really like anyone can say, you know, we know turning away refugees, we didn't know that was going to lead to the death of refugees. That's the whole point of refugees. I mean,
there's a wonderful poem that says, you don't leave unless home is a burning fire. Like
exactly. So I'd say that all the anti-immigrant people who put those laws in place and supported those laws and didn't try to overturn those laws if they were in the power to do so, I think they share a great deal of blame. And I think the people who are doing so today share blame in the refugees that they're getting killed.
Well, the readings that we had for today indicated that the bystanders really couldn't believe the reports they were hearing. And I think that they couldn't believe it because the awareness historically that this had happened before was never recognized as how heinous it really was. I think historically we're beyond that now. And as Rin says, going forward, we no longer have that excuse that we can't believe it. We know now. We are at a point that we recognize how heinous it is. It has happened many times before, and it's incumbent upon civilized people to stop it.
Well, I just want to say that I don't think that that's the motivation for most of the anti-immigrant people in the US at the very least for that, because the anti-immigrant people were anti-immigrant because they were explicitly white supremacists. That's where the wave of laws, and they were explicitly doing horrible things to non-white people in this country, to the Native Americans, to Black people. I just think most of them didn't care if you didn't fit their idea of a full person.
And Rin, I'm not really debating that. I agree with you. There's two aspects. There's the people who it's not a bug, it's a feature, and the people who couldn't believe the bug. But I think there's a convergence now because I think there is a recognition that it's happened before. It's always been a bug, and you can no longer accept it as a feature.
Okay, Lori, go ahead, and then I want to jump in as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say two things. First, that anti-Semitism was sort of a genuflect reaction by most Americans in 1930s. I mean, and certainly, you know, most of these immigration laws were designed to try to, you know, as Rin says, to prevent people that weren't you know, like what you consider to be you, to come in, and we're still doing the same thing.
And it was
the second thing I wanted to say was that it's pretty clear now from the evidence that's been declassified that by 1943, the United States government was pretty damned aware that the Holocaust was happening, that the camps were killing people in large numbers. But Roosevelt and his military advisors, Marshall, made a distinct and conscious decision not to bomb the railways, you know, not to prevent, you know, what was the things that they might be able to do, because they didn't want to divert resources. They didn't want to risk bombers where we didn't have fighter protection, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, they made conscious military decisions, and they felt that what they needed to do to win the war was more important than trying to save people that in the Holocaust. I mean, that's just reality. Whether we consider it good or bad, I'm not prepared to judge, but that was the reality. They knew what was happening, and information had come through Switzerland pretty clearly.
Right,
and we knew about it.
Let's let Kathy talk now. You want to let Kathy talk? She was going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say that in the 30s, racism was academically respectable in a lot of ways. I've often, you know, told you about some of the, I don't want to get on of some of the physical anthropologists who were quite racist and had scientific, you know, quote, scientific reasons for doing it.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It could be acceptable to some people.
Right.
And that wasn't a big deal, I guess.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to comment on, and then I'll let Roger have another word on this, is, you know, on one level, it was hard to believe for the general population. On another level, they were those foreigners over there. There was the problem that there had been a lot of war atrocity stories from the First World War that had panned out to not be true. And so they thought, well, this is just what war does. People tell terrible stories about other people. I mean, one of the complications is that for many liberals, FDR is a hero, but in this case, he was more indifferent than he should have been to what was happening to Jews. I mean, there were years they didn't even fill the quotas that they were allowed to bring in of Jews from European countries and other places because the State Department was so anti-Semitic. You know, the reality is that when the war first was a choice, you know, diverting rail stock would have, you know, might have made a difference or might not have. But before we sort of pat ourselves on the back and say, oh, but now we know this, we know what happens and we know how to respond to it. There have been genocides since then that we have not responded to particularly well, whether it was the Cultural Revolution, mass death in China in the 50s and 60s that killed tens of millions of people, or it was the Cambodian killing fields that was only stopped because communist North Vietnam, which was then Vietnam as a whole, invaded to stop the killing. There was the case of the Bosnians in the 90s. There was the case of the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda. There's today what's going on to the Uyghurs in China, where they're in re-education camps and, you know, concentration camps. There's no other word for them. Forcible conversion, all kinds of terrible things are going on there. I don't notice us grinding everything to a halt to help the Uyghurs in China. This is happening in the internet era. So, you know, we unfortunately still have that myopic approach of, if it's not happening to us, it's hard to contemplate. And who's doing it makes a difference. By the way, there are more kids in cages, quote unquote, now than there were under Trump, because of the wave of children that are migrating without parents right now. But Biden's getting a lot more of a cushy response to it than Trump was, because he's, quote, ours and not one of them. So, you know, again, I wouldn't pat ourselves on the back too fast. Sorry, Roger, you were going to jump in, then we'll go on to the next one.
My father flew in B-17s during the war in the European theater out of England. And he always told the story. I don't know if it was modern knowledge looking backwards, but he implied that at the time that they knew about the rail lines going to the camps. And yet, when they would do their missions, if they had a primary and a secondary target, and if the primary and secondary targets were weathered out, they would drop their ordnance in the English Channel rather than land with it. And he always was very resentful that even in those situations where they're putting it in the ocean, that they didn't attack any of the rail lines.
Yeah. One other thing I'll comment about the risk of fighting a war for the Jews. You might remember that Charles Lindbergh, who was an American hero, was very isolationist in the 1940s. You know, Philip Roth did a wonderful counterfactual history called The Plot Against America, imagining that Lindbergh beat Roosevelt on an isolationist platform in 1940. And, you know, so if anti-Semitism was a very popular sentiment in America, if people started to feel like this was a war for the Jews, they might not support the war. And by the way, Jews voted for Roosevelt like 95 to 5, or maybe it was 95% for Roosevelt and 5% for the socialist candidate. I mean, it was overwhelmingly pro-Roosevelt. And so he didn't need to appeal to their votes. They were a given. It was other populations he was more worried about. So again, you know, that's that calculation we don't like to think about, but Roosevelt the hero might also be Roosevelt the villain. Number 5, why do you think survivor stories in Holocaust studies and museums were not made public until the 60s and 70s? We talked about this earlier on, about who's ready to hear the story, who's ready to tell the story. You know, at a certain point, you know, having a sense of suffering can become, you know, a self-defense against just being white. If people are complaining about what the white people have done, and more importantly, it's not comfortable to hear people's trauma. And you know, talking about yourself as a victim or sufferer or survivor, you were supposed to be tough and strong in an earlier era, and hearing these trauma stories was not socially acceptable until a later period. So now the last question, which actually is an interesting one for me, because I'm looking at getting a new car this summer, and one of them I'm looking at is a Volkswagen. Are reparations and recriminations, from art treasures to personal boycotts of German automobiles, still worth the effort? Why or why not? And I will tell you one anecdote related to this. One year, Kohodash was walking in a parade in Highland Park in Deerfield, and we happened to use a BMW as the car that we put our banners on to walk with. And I got a nasty letter from somebody saying, how dare a Jewish congregation use a German car for their float for this parade? And my gut response to him was, have you ever looked at a parking lot of a synagogue? Like, how many Mercedes and BMWs and Volkswagens you see there? But even more importantly, you know, maybe for some people that's a past generation, and we buy Japanese cars. And there are many people of that era who would not have bought Japanese cars for a similar reason. So what do you think? And there was just a case, I think, this last month where a 99-year-old was deported for having lied on his immigration papers about whether he had ever been part of the Nazi Party. He was a guard in a camp, and they shipped him off to Germany to face trial at 99 years old. So do you feel like it's worth it? Why or why not?
Well, I'd say, oh, go ahead.
I would just like to say two things. First of all, I own a Ford, and I can't think of anybody more anti-Semitic than Henry Ford, as far as that goes. So the other thing is that, you know, future generations of Germans aren't responsible for what their grandparents did at this point. And I'm not sure that, I mean, in Germany, unlike Japan, has actually made an effort in the post-war era to pay reparations and to, you know, try to undo as much as you can possibly undo such a horrible thing.
You can't undo it.
But I think personally, I think it's sort of silly to boycott a German automobile in 2021 over stuff that's 71 years old. That being said, I know some Armenians that wouldn't touch Turkish coffee with a 10-foot pole. So yeah.
Well, and Turkey has denied the Armenian genocide, so maybe
Right, exactly.
variable.
And as I say, and you know what, you go to Korea, you're not going to see a Japanese car. I mean, not a one. I've been there 3 times. I have never seen a Japanese car. They will not buy Japanese cars. The Chinese will, but the Koreans are holding a grudge, and they've never been apologized to or help, you know, or for what happened to them and by the Japanese. So I understand that. Anyway.
Well, I would say that the past is full of horrors, no matter how far back or how little you go. And the effort perhaps is better put into making the future better for everybody. Adam has rightly called out the Uyghurs and the Hutus and the Tutsis. And maybe it would be better for those of us of conscience to try to do something to improve people going forward as a priority, and address past imbalances and injustices if they're not having direct impact going forward, which begs the question of reparations, which is a separate question. But just to try to right an old wrong, you can't do them all. So maybe we ought to focus on the future.
No one wants to take the perspective that justice needs to be done. Sorry, Ren, go ahead.
I'd say, I mean, I think, first of all, reparations and recriminations are 2 different things. I think reparations are good, and especially, and of course, reparations are different things. If the reparations are to an individual who has been hurt either firsthand or because of sort of secondhand, you know, I still don't have the inheritance that I would have had if okay, cool. I thought my internet went out for a moment. You know, reparations I think are useful to go ahead and help restore justice. Recriminations, I mean, I think recriminations for groups that aren't the perpetrators. Like, Germany has a completely different government. You can't blame modern Germany for stuff that the previous government, you know, Nazi government did. You can blame individuals who were involved. You can and you can have the government pay reparations because they've essentially inherited benefits from the previous government. But I think it's very different from inheriting blame. And so I think, you know, boycotting of that. I mean, if you're going to do that, there's no group in the entire world that has not at some time in their past done atrocities. I mean, I'm an American. I can hardly go ahead and, you know, blame all of America, you know, boycott myself in America because of various atrocities committed by various Americans over the years. And then even in terms of in a more gray area, in terms of punishments of actual individuals, I mean, that goes to, I mean, what exactly is the purpose of punishment? Is punishment is the goal of punishment to encourage better behavior in the future, or is punishment just a fancy term for revenge? And you get into really more of a moral quandary there, I think, in terms of, you know, let's say someone has truly reformed, has been reformed for years, you know, is the right thing to do to punish them for something they did when they were a completely different person? Is that justice? Or is that merely revenge that's adding pain to the world? I know
Well,
that's going a little beyond the scope of the question,
no, but it's fine.
but
I
it
mean,
is related, I think.
part of the challenge, though, is that in this case, there's a third option. It's not just prevention as a model, and it's not just revenge for cruelty's sake. They've never acknowledged they did this. You know, there's a difference between acknowledging you did it and reforming yourself and working to be a better person, and hiding the fact that you did this for 80 years and thinking you got away with it when you murdered these people. You know, there's something to be said for, even if it's delayed, justice needs to be done in those circumstances. If someone has, you know, lied and gotten away with it, just because, look, if someone made a living out of the gold teeth that they extracted from those, I'm not going to say that because I didn't find it until 1999 or 2021, well, they can keep all the interest they earned in that, you know, and they have to pay back. No, they don't get away with it. Something needs to happen there to find some.
And
it is
I think
justice. It's not just revenge.
And I think that there goes to what is reform. I mean, if they were put in the same situation today, would they do the same thing? And I think someone who, you know, kept their riches and, you know, sort of just tried to get away with it, that doesn't suggest actual reform, but merely being in a situation where that's no longer the most fruitful form of action.
Well, but would it count as reform if they wouldn't acknowledge it, that they did it?
Well, the other thing is, to kind of to the victor go to the spoils. The victor in this case were the Allies, not the Jews. It was the Allies who had the Nuremberg trials. There were Jewish prosecutors, but and they held them responsible for the things they did in the camps to a number of people besides the Jews. But I don't know that there's any historical precedence for kind of restitution, because it wasn't even the Jews who were prosecuting them, so to speak.
Well, a comment was made in the chat by Alan also that, you know, police search cold cases. You try to solve the problem and you try to do justice. Look, I'll give you another example that's particularly painful. Some of you may know there's a huge backlog of untested rape kits all over the country where women were raped. They said, I was raped. They went to a hospital. They collected samples, including DNA samples and skin samples, whatever they could find. They put them into a kit waiting for it to be tested. And it's been sitting for 10, 20, 30 years. And police departments have not prioritized testing them because they haven't prioritized prosecuting rape and dealing with those violent criminals who've done terrible things. And just because it's 30 years later and they haven't bothered to test the rape kit, it's an even worse injustice. You know, and I don't care what that rapist did with the rest of his life. And I don't care who he was nice to. There's some justice to be done there by having them caught for the crime they committed and having them pay a consequence for it. So, you know, I'm not like one who would want to spend a whole, you know, department of huge resources to track down the 98-year-olds that are left who might have gotten away with it. Part of the historian in me would like to find out who they were and provide documentation of that. Maybe that provides some, you know, meager consolation. But you know, in the end, we do need to move forward, but you need to move forward on a basis of truth and a basis of acceptance. And, you know, that's where Germany, honestly, I don't boycott them anymore because of all the work the German government has done in working against neo-Nazi organizations in Germany, providing public memorials for the Holocaust, acknowledging the guilt of what they had done as a collective, as a people, you know, much more so than Americans have acknowledged some of the guilt of things that they've done collectively as a people. And honestly, providing reparations to Israel early on in Israel's existence was vital for its survival. It was a hugely controversial issue, by the way, in Israel, whether or not to accept the reparations, because for them it was blood money. And it was their, I mean, this was in 1950, 51, 50. I mean, these are the murderers here who are giving them the money. But in the end, they needed it and they accepted it. But it was hugely controversial even then. And German reparations continued, over many decades. In fact, ironically, talking about German cars, a lot of the cabs in Israel are German cars because of preferential trade terms that Israel has with Germany, even now as an echo of those reparations after the Holocaust.